Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
Confirmed cases of coronavirus in Russia remain remarkably low, but there has been a suspicious spike in cases of pneumonia. Opposition rallies have been banned in the interest of public health, but not preparations for the May 9th Victory Day parade and not for the April 22nd referendum on Vladimir Putin's proposed constitutional amendments, at least not yet. Oil prices are tanking and the ruble is crashing. But until days ago, the Kremlin continued with happy talk and insisting that the crisis is contained and under control. And abroad, the Putin regime clearly views the global pandemic as not just a crisis, but also as an opportunity. Welcome to Russia in the time of coronavirus. Hello from my condo in Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C., where I am observing federal and local self-isolation guidelines, and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where I am told there is an old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to our brave new world.
Thank you both to everybody. There most definitely is an old town.
And also joining us from her home down the street from me in lovely DuPont Circle in our nation's capital is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. So let's start this out really broadly. We've all been kind of watching it this week. Don and I both have pieces out on it, on different aspects of it. But a crisis can clearly tell you a lot about a society and about a polity. What have we learned so far from the coronavirus crisis about the Putin regime? What do we see here, Maria? I know you've been following this closely and commenting on it on social media. What are your thoughts on this?
Brian, I would make several points. We are obviously very early in this crisis, and Russia is late in the game. There were several factors, such as the constitutional amendments that distracted the attention of the society. So probably the scale of crisis is not still understood in Russia. Everything's still working. People are advised not to go to work. So social distancing starts being implemented, but nothing really is quarantined yet. And that, of course, keeping in mind how extensive Chinese tourism has been in Russia, still in December and January, when the coronavirus was already spreading across China. This definitely suggests the situation is actually gloomy. But the awareness of that is still quite low. People start awakening, but that's slow. And most importantly, the Russian authorities do what they always do in these situations. That is, they try to silence the information as much as possible. Rospotrebnadzor, the Roskomnadzor and several Russian agencies have actually specifically issued announcements that they will be prosecuting anyone who spreads quote-unquote disinformation or fake news about the coronavirus, and several people have already been fined. One of them, who is allegedly facing some fines, is Russian political analyst Valery Solovey, who we commonly quote here in this broadcast.
We all know.
And we all know.
Yes.
He actually suggested 3 days ago in his Echo of Moscow broadcast, he suggested that, in fact, the real numbers of deaths are not reported. That is actually about 1,600 deaths confirmed at least points, and officially there's just one. And as a result, in fact, and there's actually hundreds of thousands sick. And as a result, his podcast was actually erased from the Echo of Moscow, banned by the Russian authorities, and he himself faces fines.
I want to drill down into a little bit this about Maria, and I want to bring Don in on this as well, because the number of reported cases in Russia is absurdly low. Friends of mine have been reaching out to me on social media asking that are not really Russia people are saying, what the hell is going on with this? Two of my high school classmates reached out on Facebook. And I mean, as of right now, Russia has 253 reported cases, which is let's get real. I mean, that's less than the DC metro area. Right. Yeah. In one death, they share this very long border with China where the outbreak happened. They, of course, border Europe. Yet, at the same time, there has been, RBC reported this week, that there is this suspicious spike in pneumonia that's happening this year. Russia seems to be not suffering from coronavirus, but there seems to be some pneumonia outbreak. And there's a 37% rise, according to Rosstat, the Russian statistics agency,
in Moscow.
Adds up to about 2,000 cases. What do you see? I mean, do you see outright suppression of it going on right now, Maria?
So I have zero doubt, Brian, that the Russian authorities are going to be silencing this issue. First of all, as I mentioned before, Russia, if any other country in the world, probably is the one, unfortunately, to have the major hit from this disease because of the extreme or the very high levels of tourism of Chinese tourists in Russia as late as December and January, when, as we know, the virus was already quite spread across China. And second of all, we know, as a matter of fact, that's what the Russian authorities always do. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what Solovey himself cited in his Moscow Echo of Moscow interview. Like, remember Chernobyl? Or remember the sinking of the Russian submarine Kursk. The Russians are always the last ones to learn about that. Typically, they learn about that only after there is a public awareness in the West and the Western media starts publishing about it. And then finally, the Russian authorities have to communicate this information to the Russian population. That's exactly what we're witnessing right now. And actually, I have to say that the Russian authorities are going already to unprecedented lengths to making this unprecedented effort to silence the information, as demonstrated by the rising number of fines against, quote unquote, spreading the fake news about coronavirus.
So you never let a crisis go to waste. Don, you got a piece out today on this. And I'm also noticing a bunch of other interesting things, like the ban on gatherings of 50 or more people is clearly being used to stop opposition rallies. Which probably, quite frankly, as somebody who's kind of a fan of opposition rallies in Russia, aren't really a good idea right now anyway. And you also saw today that they're using facial recognition software to see who is violating quarantine orders. So the crisis is not being wasted in terms of how to fine tune the tools of repression, if you will. What do you see out there, Don?
First of all, I very much like your first question. A couple points about patterns of behavior, I guess I would say, was that on the reporting issue, I find it highly suspicious that such a high percentage of cases are in Moscow and not outside the capital. It's very suspicious, something like 50%, something like that. It's as though the cities outside the capital, and Petersburg and Yekaterinburg are also very low, are not reporting at all, which means the numbers are probably really, really much higher.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It doesn't surprise me there's a high amount of cases in Moscow. I mean, it's a city of what, 50 million right now? I mean,
exactly. Of course there would be, and they have a relatively modern medical system, and that's where they would be. But what's going on in St. Petersburg, or what's going on in Yekaterinburg and the other large cities? There are a lot of large cities, and there's almost no cases.
I can't help but recall the excellent joke Maria said that was making the rounds in Russia. How many coronavirus cases are there? 35. How many tests have they done? 35. Well, I think that pretty much sums it up. What do you make of this pneumonia?
Let me one more thing, Brian. Okay, on the pneumonia, I think you're the first person who highlighted it to me. I think it's not hilarious. It's tragicomic that they would be so clumsy about this. You can put the referendum in the state of emergency. I know you want to talk about it later, to aside for a second. I just find that Kremlin behavior in general, Kremlin court politics, a lot of the kind of stuff that's going on inside the elite is not, we've seen it many times before, blaming the West. Putin's was doing earlier in the week a TV spot, man on the street with Lugar, blaming the West and all that kind of thing. And we saw the EU report as well that they are nonetheless trying to weaponize it for offensive use overseas.
Yeah,
and
we're going to talk about that in the second half.
Yeah, the other point I would make is that the clan politics, there's talk of Mishustin already being in some trouble. Galikova sort of disappeared as the't person and so forth. And now the chairman of the central bank is said to have not responded quickly enough. And as always with Kremlinology, what is rumors, what is really going on, and what are rumors used to get your opponent is simply unclear.
Now, you in your piece today, you said there was some chatter out there about a debate inside the inner circle about whether or not to declare a state of emergency. Can you tell me a little bit more?
Yeah, and then I'm addicted to Russian social media. So there evidently was talk of this, and the couple pieces I saw said the advocates of a state of emergency, and they pinpointed the head of the power ministries, are pretty strongly for it. The government was against it. And it was noted by, I believe, the commentator that, of course, a health emergency could be easily used for political purposes if either the referendum or anything else got out of control. So these crises blend into each other. And
yes.
And a state of emergency would be absolutely convenient for the kind of people who wanted to make sure Putin got the result he wanted on April and not later. And that, of course, includes Putin himself.
Yeah, Maria, let's bring this all together because there's a lot going on in Russia right now. I mean, we got the constitutional referendum. We have the very big May 9th Victory Day celebrations that the regime always tries to turn into a legitimization ritual. And you got this very real global pandemic and a situation, I think, that a virus doesn't care about your propaganda. A virus doesn't care. It doesn't give a damn what Kiselyov says on Echo Nedeli, right? It doesn't care about Putin's Bolshoi press-conferencia. He doesn't care about any of these things. It's just going to go. But yet you got all these other things going on in Russia and agendas at work. How do you see this changing the dynamic right now?
Frankly, I think this is bad news for the Kremlin. They were late, as I mentioned before. The virus is probably spread, and if it is as vicious as really is reported in the West, we're going to see something. We're likely to see some really big issues, some even catastrophic developments in Russia. It's also important to add the economic dimension in the perspective, and Don's piece very wisely mentions that. So we have a population that already isn't doing well. The economy is stagnating. We have discussed that the support for the authorities has been actually slowly eroding precisely because of the socioeconomic situation. Right now, we also have the population that has been overcredited. That means that there's more credits than they're able to pay back. On average, if they were to pay essentially to pay what they're credited for, I think 1/3 of loans actually requires the Russians to return 60% of the monthly income. Nobody is able to do that. So this is actually an imminent crisis there. And also Russians have very little reserves and savings. Unlike maybe American population, they're not able to sustain themselves in the long run if accidentally they will be left without jobs. This is, of course, is very gloomy, and the Kremlin is trying to catch up. They actually just issued, as we speak, in the first hearing, passed this law that would increase spending to the Russians. But it's not really clear how they're helping to cope with that in the long term. Frankly, I don't think they will be, we'll see, of course, but I don't think they will be able to run all this April 22nd plebiscite if this dynamic continues as of now. To be honest, there already seems to be rethinking this. Some people reported that the announcement that discusses general voting for the constitutional amendments no longer mentioned the date. this is possibly an indication that they're rethinking.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Maria, I saw another story that maybe they could do it over 3 days. You know, they need to roll up some credible numbers, and it's going to be hard.
That's another possibility, yeah.
And they could try internet voting, which would give them just wonderful possibilities for falsifying the results.
Yeah, definitely. That's always a possibility.
I find it hard to imagine them not having May 9th. I mean, that this is so fetishized in Russia. I just find it just hard to imagine that not happening. Can you? I mean, Maria, you're Russian. You lived with us your whole life. Can you imagine May 9th not happening in Russia?
It's true. It's hard to imagine, but we'll see what happens. They always can run. And remember how in Moscow, Sobyanin organized this the day of public transportation, where all these empty streets, these huge lines of buses and trucks and different cleaning services, were passing by. So this is always possible to do, right? I mean, everyone has a television. You didn't necessarily have all these mass public events. They probably able to substitute.
You do it virtually, like we're doing our staff meetings every week virtually, which could get entry. Don, anything to add here? How do you see all of these things kind of converging?
Two points. One, I think that you and I and Maria have been so busy with so many things, including with this podcast. I think the Saudi OPEC deal was sort of passed by too quickly, which was a major thing, a major blow to the Russian economy. The other thing I would mention is that there do seem to be tensions in the elite at a higher level. Deripaska was out on his own a couple of days ago on his social media. I think it was Telegrama, talking about the need for a state of emergency. Sechin, the Chinese and all that stuff, and Brian, you mentioned this, I believe, on social media yesterday. The China-Russia relationship seems to be in some trouble, or at least strain. And so there's a lot going on all at once. I'm not going to call it a black swan, but for those people, especially abroad, who think that the regime is so much in control of everything, I think one of the lessons we've seen the last couple of weeks is that it's not, and that to some extent they are just reacting like everybody else is. And so it gives the impression of a much less confident regime when you see the totality of all this evidence, gossip, and everything else that people have been talking about.
Well, I sure would have liked to have been a fly on the wall for that Putin-Xi phone call that took place this week. I'm wondering what they what they talked about there.
And I have one more footnote point on this, Brian, is that when I wrote the article yesterday, I went down all the things that the government is doing. And yes, Maria, I very much agree they've been late. And on paper, it all looks credible. But there's an issue, again, about Putin's Russia, which is state capacity. Can they do these things without corruption or effectively? And that's something we've seen fall far short of the mark many times before. Not just the course, Brian, but I'm glad you brought that up.
No, the Kursk, I mean, that was just as I was leaving Russia in 2000. It was the very beginning of Putin's time in power. And it's just kind of ironic. I mean, I don't think we're coming to the end of Putin's time, but I don't either. It's interesting to see something like this at this point where they seem ineffectual. I do want to stick with this Russia-China thing in another way a little bit, because a lot of the commentary out there is talking about how the different ways that authoritarian and democratic countries are handling this. And China, of course, in the very early days botched it because they just covered it up and were in denial, which slowed them down. But then China's getting praised for the methods they came in, kind of quarantining Wuhan. Yesterday, China, it was the very first day since this started, they didn't report a new case. And now Italy has actually surpassed China. So you saw the weaknesses in, for lack of a better term, strengths of an authoritarian regime there. How do you see this playing out in Russia? I mean, how do we compare Russia and China as authoritarian regimes in handling this? Could you see, for example, Russia, if it had to, doing a Wuhan-style kind of quarantine of a place like Moscow? Maria, Don, either of you, feel free to jump in.
Well, I wanted to comment on the second point and not answer your question directly. I'll let Maria do that. I thought China got a huge amount of PR by the symbolic or real aid to Italy. And and that paid off hugely. And whoever suggested that in the Chinese foreign ministry should be promoted because that paid huge dividends, one symbolic act. People were immediately comparing it to the lack of action by the Germans and other countries in the West. And I think somebody there thought a little bit ahead. I can't see Russia ever doing that, frankly.
No, but more internally, and I agree, and I want to talk about the foreign policy implications in the second half. But I mean, in terms of domestically, I mean, how China, the first part of it showed the very weakness of this centralized authoritarian regime, and the second, their kind of recovery. Something you couldn't do. I mean, it would be very difficult to do in a democratic society, but basically putting an entire region on total lockdown. How do you see this playing out in Russia? Or Maria, if you want to jump in here too.
Yeah, I think the first stage actually is very similar across both regimes, right? They try to silence, denial, just because they can, right? Democracy just cannot do that because they have very different media environment and transparency.
In the U.S., you had people who were trying to be.
They were trying to, but it's actually hurt them
in the media environment here.
If anything, in the long run. It's the opposite situation in democracies where they actually can promote, they can actually possibly have too much information and people get scared really easily. In Russia, unfortunately, but the second stage differs between China and Russia. In China, the authorities, after recognizing apparently the amount, the real serious danger that the virus has brought, actually have taken unprecedented measures. I have a bunch of friends who go to China and I spoke to them. Honestly, it's extremely impressive. It's some kind of combination of a very loyal political culture, very obedient political culture with extreme sophistication of new technologies. So the penetration was such that they were able to track all the contacts that a person has had throughout the day, including in the groceries, on the streets, in the trains, and even in China, the efficiency was so high that actually provoked some backlash from Chinese people for the state to violate their privacy. Can you believe it? Right. Some people even suggested this is the beginning of democratization of the country. We'll see about that, but that just shows you the extent to which how efficient the Chinese state actually was. Even if I'm still a little bit reluctant to trust the numbers they report. In Russia, unfortunately, it's the opposite situation. As Don correctly pointed out, the state capacity is extremely low, and the state is itself in decay, as demonstrated by the decline of support for the authorities and also the fact that people try to avoid dealing with the state as much as possible. So they're still actually in this denial phase right now, when actually several months later, and there's zero indication that they're going to be able to be as efficient and Chinese people are. Also, I have to bring up the culture, the political culture. Unlike a very obedient Chinese population that will do what they're told, at least based on my understanding. The Russians are, exactly. very opposite, to say the least. But I have to say the understanding spreads, the Russian society actually grows. I hear that people, for example, in the streets, they try to keep distance. There's no sneezing, no coughing in the public transport, because apparently those who feel sick, they don't go to work. That's responsible. And we also know the numbers that, for example, the usage of Moscow public transportation, for example, the Moscow metro, the subway, has decreased by 30%. So that's significant. That shows that people actually pay attention to this. Still, however, I don't really imagine the Russian authorities be anywhere close to China. Just a small anecdote. The one person who was finally officially reported dead yesterday because of this coronavirus, she actually was portrayed by the Russian federal TV as having died of pretty much everything. Because she was portrayed as someone who was so sick with multiple extra diseases that you can hardly blame coronavirus for really doing that, because there were so many other things going on.
Maria, I actually watched that. That was quite a lamentable example of television broadcasting.
Yeah, but just shows you where the Russian state is with all of that still.
Well, I mean, a shape of things to come. And I'm looking at the curve right now on this. And while the numbers, of course, are much reported numbers are much lower, the curve in Russia looks very similar to the curve we saw in Italy. or we are now seeing in New York City. Just a couple other little tidbits I noticed. Sergei Shoigu, Russian defense minister, has said that the spring draft will go ahead as planned. Interesting enough. The spring draft for the Russian armed forces. All new recruits will be checked for the virus when they come in. And Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman or designated liar, said there was, quote, no need for President Putin to take a coronavirus test because he hasn't shown any symptoms. Anything to add, Don?
Just two quick points. One is an unsubstantiated generalization, but I'll say it anyway, which is to say, I often hear Russians, and forgive me, Maria, for speaking for you, complain that the elites don't really have a sense of the state, the nationhood as a community in the way that China may, other countries do, Italy being one. And I think a lot of people just don't trust the elites to do the right thing when the chips are down, unless forced to. And I'll just leave it at that. The other point, Brian, is that in my trolling of social media last night, maybe it was Olivier, I saw a reference to trouble in the army in terms of high infection rates and some unease at the extent to which it has spread there. I don't know.
Go ahead, Maria. Did you want to jump in? No. Okay. One other thing I wanted to dive into was, why did the official line, the official attitude, it seemed to change really, not dramatically, but it changed visibly this week, where they seemed to be in absolute, complete, and total denial until a couple of days ago. Maria, was there anything that happened that you think sparked that?
Well, to be honest, I think they follow the Europe and the United States. The United States was essentially last week, when the extreme measures have been taken, the realization came, and apparently the Kremlin, I think, followed this awareness. I think we often underestimate to what extent the Kremlin is actually reliant on the information that comes from the Europe and the Western countries, is in part because they eliminated any ability, even for themselves, to trust their own media domestically, since they really eliminated all the independent media in the first place. So in this sense, I think they just finally realized that the situation was much more serious. Prior to that, the realization wasn't there, and people were just laughing it out. There is also, more on the ideological level, there is a very different attitude towards the value of human life in Russia as opposed to Western countries. And so in Russia, the value of human life is perceived as not as important, and so they at least view themselves as being less cautious and overly protective than the Western countries are. This, in part, at least explains this delayed realization of the seriousness of the virus, unfortunately.
There's an irony to that, given that Russia is going through a severe demographic crisis right now, and that human life is actually a matter of almost national security. And
it's true, but it's also because of that, right? There's so many people dying on a daily basis. It's almost became a routine, not something that you really perceive as an emergency situation.
And to add to your point, Brian, Maria. The fact, again, there are things piling on each other. The fact that the referendum and May Day are approaching means that the authorities, for whatever motives, less noble, less humanitarian, have to pay attention because they're running up against deadlines, which means they have to do something or risk the whole thing going off the rails.
Right. Okay, well, that's a good way to segue. In a few moments, we'll continue our discussion and look at how COVID-19 is influencing Russia's foreign policy. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA, joining us from his home in beautiful Alexandria, Virginia, which does in fact have an old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from her home in beautiful DuPont Circle in our nation's capital is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So there are two aspects of Russian foreign policy I want to discuss here, one kind of meta and one kind of micro. According to a report from the European Union, Russian media has unleashed a, quote, significant disinformation campaign against the West to aggravate the impact of the coronavirus crisis, generate panic, and sow distrust. According to the report, which is cited by Reuters, the Russian campaign is pushing fake news online in English, Spanish, Italian, German, and French, and uses contradictory, confusing, and malicious reports to make it harder for the EU to communicate its response to the pandemic. In the macro sense, an op-ed in the Kremlin mouthpiece Izvestia by Valdai Club chairman Andrei Bystritsky argues that the West is overreaching on the coronavirus and is being ineffectual in its overreaction. And this, like a major war, according to Bystritsky, could bring down the liberal international order. And that, coincidentally enough, is a long-standing goal of Russian foreign policy. I had a piece out earlier on this week. Don, Maria, your thoughts on either or both of these aspects, the disinfo campaign, the what appears to be the opinion in the ruling elite in Russia that this crisis could be used to bring down the liberal international order, or anything else in foreign affairs you see. Feel free.
All right. First of all, Brian, I want to thank you for flagging that item earlier in the week, because that had not occurred to me, but this is how they look at it, or might look at it. But this is exactly how some of them probably do. However, I think it's part of the general gob of spaghetti they always throw against the wall and see what sticks. And I think this is when they have another opportunity to be opportunistic and think if they can exploit, they're going to do that too. But I think the boomeranging of the disease, or the entry into a disease inside of Russia, undercuts that substantially, because I do not think a lot of people are going to blame the West for coronavirus. I think a lot of people know it came from China to begin with, and so forth. So I think it's a nice try, or an unpleasant try, but we will see. But Brian,
I think what Bystritsky was arguing was, I mean, it's a very interesting and nuanced argument.
It is
the first point is that the West is overreacting to this. This is really no big deal. This is just the flu. Does that sound familiar? But it was like not like a big deal. And he's saying, and the West is overreacting to this and being very ineffective in its overreaction. And as a result of all this, people are going to get tired of suffering, tired of washing their hands, tired of sitting in their homes, tired of not shaking hands, tired of not getting in airplanes. And they're just going to rebel against these international liberal institutions. Now, remember, Bystritsky's role, he's the chairman of the Valdai Club, which is one of these Russian institutions that tries to prevent the nice, reasonable things in the West. And his tone in the piece, and I had to read it over a couple times to kind of get it. And Maria, I even actually had you take a look at it to see if I was misunderstanding the Russian. Was he being ironic or not? But the tone was actually one of concern. Oh, isn't this awful that the European Union can't coordinate itself? And isn't it awful that our good friends in the West are overreacting to this, this minor flu outbreak and banning flights and putting people in quarantine? And oh, isn't this just awful that the international order is going to come down? But at the end of the day, this thing was published in Izvestia, which is like, the closest thing to a Kremlin mouthpiece as you can get. So it was interesting. Maria, what did you make of that piece? I mean, I know as a Russian-born individual, you have this sixth sense for reading between the lines on pieces like this.
Hopefully, also they say, right? So I think Bystritsky is a very interesting piece, and then thank you for sending along with your very good article, Brian. I really enjoyed reading it too. So I think there's 3 points to make here. First of all, Bystritsky, like the skepticism and half irony about the West being overly protective and cautious. This is exactly the reflection of this overall Russian ideology that, as I mentioned before, right, the human life is not as important as the West tries to portray it. We all are going to die either way, right? That's a very Russian concept. And so, like, you can just save yourself no matter what. The second point is very interesting, along the lines that Alexander Baun from Carnegie actually made today on the social networks. For many Russians, implicitly, the West or Europe is still this like last resort. When things come crashing in Russia, this is when you're going to go hiding. Even if you are personally ahead of the Wild Eye Club, you still are going to hopefully go to Europe, to Côte d'Azur, or somewhere in Italy. And so to them, this is also a little bit of a collapse of this ideal last resort, which they actually was saving for themselves. Hence, the implicit sadness, I think, that Bystritsky, you can hear and you can read in between Bystritsky's lines. And ultimately,
do you think sorry to interrupt, do you think his concern and almost sadness was sincere?
And in part, it's both. Right? I think as we have discussed in the past, the Russian elites or the establishment, they have convinced themselves, right, in a lot of crazy things that you would not even think people can believe in the past. Like they think that the West is purposefully trying to destroy Russia. Some of them really have convinced themselves after so many years of being deep into the propaganda they've been spreading, right? It's some kind of professional bias. You have to at least somewhat believe the things you're saying. So I think, yes, that actually sounded that he believed in it. And of course, but that doesn't deny the fact that he also has some political goals associated to that piece, right? He needs to precisely spread this perception of collapsing liberal order. And by the way, he's not completely wrong, right? I would say that we do observe the closure of the national borders these days. We do see that the European Union has shown its weakness, right? The states have to deal with their own issues, like Italian case has demonstrated. There is also the situation with the U.S. president, where doesn't have really also help to increase stability in the transatlantic alliance. So in this sense, we do observe some weakening of the transatlantic order. It's in some ways it's inevitable. The only difference that here we hope and expect this is going to be a temporary emergency measure. But it is true that the world is going to be different after we hopefully are done with this disease. And in this sense, Bystritsky, for me, or maybe I'm just too Russian, I don't think he's absolutely wrong, right? He does point out some objective problems that emerge in these days. But the only difference is that the West, as it always does, will eventually resolve that. It's way less clear whether Russia is going to be able to resolve this. And I do not really expect Russian information at this moment to be really effective, just because there's so many domestic issues to deal with. I think they're going to be eventually a little bit distracted by what's going on at home.
Because I do agree with you that he's not I think he's wrong that we're overreacting to it. But I do agree that this does pose a very serious challenge to the liberal Western rules-based order. I mean, I'm a little nervous about this. There was a piece in Foreign Affairs yesterday about how China is going to use this is already using this to undermine, to kind of to move toward global leadership. Don, you pointed in the first half the Chinese aid to Italy. I would actually point out it's not just Italy; it's also Poland, it's also Serbia. So in this sense, the one point I wanted to make in my piece, but we had to cut out for space, was I did want to make this point that the West needs to lead in this and lead in accordance with its values and strengthen its institutions in order to do this, because there is a threat to global liberalism as a result of this. And it's certain, I'm not sure Russia is going to be the one to take advantage of it, maybe China. But I don't know. What are your thoughts? Would you guys agree with that there's a bit of a threat to global liberalism?
I'd say more than a bit of a threat, Brian. It's significant. And one can either be optimistic, as Maria was, and I think I still lean in that way, thinking of World War II, when the Western democracies took a long time to respond effectively. I'm hoping it goes that way, but the order, the international system, the world order will be changed forever, and in ways we can't expect. One other point about the article, Brian, was that he didn't just say much about China, which shows to me that it was Valdai slickly packaged propaganda. But I wanted to make a third point, Brian, which is that I think Maria correctly talks about the West as some kind of idealized Oz for a lot of Russians. And this, I think, remains. And I think it gets to the need for Putin to have the West come to his May Day celebration, which is now in some doubt. I think that remains an idealized model of Russians, a backup, an alternative way. And I think that's still going to remain no matter how bad it is in Italy or any of the other places, Spain, that have been hit so hard.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really is worrying me is I do not see a coordinated transatlantic response right now. I don't even see a coordinated EU response, to be quite honest. And this is really worrying me because this is undermining the idea of the West. Before we wrap it up, I did want to talk about this disinfo campaign. Now, Reuters and other media, the first place I saw it was Reuters, reported on this EU report. The U.S. came out, the State Department earlier had said that Russia was pushing disinformation on this. I have not seen much detail on this myself, and it's not for a lack of looking. I know very early in the game, there was stuff were popping up about the so-called Lugars, the Lugar Center in Georgia, which was a center set up by former Senator Lugar to combat biological warfare in the country of Georgia. And this has always been a bugaboo for Russian propaganda that this was some kind of secret evil bioweapons laboratory when it was basically a form of assistance to Georgia from the U.S. I saw that there were reports that there are fake reports that this was where this all originated. The Chinese, of course, were pushing the idea that it was hatched in a lab in North Carolina. But this stuff to me all had the feeling of the CIA invented AIDS kind of, and the moon landing never took place, and the kind of silly Soviet propaganda we saw in the 70s, much less so than the more sophisticated stuff we've been seeing of late. What can either of you say about the disinfo campaign we've been seeing? Have you come across anything of note, either of you?
Well, Brian, I would actually say that I was thirsting for a look at the report yesterday when I read the press reports. But I think a lot of this fits nicely with the testimony of Leah Gabrielle, the head of the GEC, and our own president, Dr. Polyakova, earlier in the month in Congress, and they laid out in impressive detail the details very well. And I think our two colleagues' comments on the Hill and also the report this week, if we could ever see it, ought to be seen as kind of a very convincing case of what's happening.
I'm quite surprised that the EU has not made that report public. Maria,
Me too.
Have you seen anything interesting?
Me too.
Well, I just have to say that from the narratives that this report summarized that Russia spreads, they honestly seem to be going everywhere. So there doesn't seem to be one consistent narrative that they promote. First of all, of course, you can argue they always do that, right? Most of the time, the purpose is create this extra noise. But at the same time, it also, I think, suggests that they haven't yet come up with a particular strategy, because they portrayed at the same time the virus as the Anglo-Saxon plot to counter China.
Right, that was one of the first narratives. Yeah,
Created in the U.S. or maybe Latvia or wherever. But then at the same time, they try to diminish the importance of the virus, and as we have discussed, portray that as over cautiousness by the Western countries. So again, it goes a little bit in different direction. I don't think it actually shows a presence of some consistent strategy at this point. And of course, just my personal favorite, of course, is their early days of the coronavirus in early February 2019. The Vremya, the Russian first channel.
February of 2019?
Oh, sorry, February 2030. Vremya reported that coronavirus is definitely developed in the United States. And why? That's because in the name Corona Crown, right, is what does that remind you of? Somehow it reminds you of pageants organized by Donald Trump in which he crowned the beautiful ladies. And that's essentially the virus that literally they reported that the virus is named after Donald Trump. Yeah.
That's
a stretch, but okay.
A little bit of a stretch. It was Vremya.
It sounds like him, right? All All right. Well, we are pushing up against the end here. Do either of you have any last thoughts before we wrap it up? I'm sure this is not the last time we talk about
Brian,
this.
we didn't talk about May Day, but we could probably hold that for another.
Well, do you have anything to say about May Day?
No, I guess maybe he wants that approval. Maybe they're going to have it on Zoom. I don't know, but it's not going to do it by the way we're talking now, and we'll have Putin's voice come in and out through the whole parade. I don't know, but he's in a hurry, clearly.
Well, on that note, we will wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA, and joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where, yes, Virginia, there really is an old town, has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from her home in DuPont Circle, just down the street from my home in Adams Morgan in our nation's capital, has been Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Due to social distancing, none of us have gotten a haircut today, I can assure you. Thank you both for an enlightening discussion.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'd like to also thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and well-sanitized and in working order throughout our experimentally socially distanced discussion. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Wash your hands, use hand sanitizer, practice social distancing, don't touch your face, keep calm and carry on, and join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.